I think as criminologists, we can see violence in two ways. I think we can see it as violence defined by the law. And so when we think about that, we think about occurrences of assault and intimate partner violence and robbery and sexual assault and all those sorts of things. But I think there's another way in which we can understand that, and that's structural violence. And this is the kind of violence that leaves rural peoples as casualties of a system. So, for example, in Canada, Indigenous people being pushed out of and onto reserves and off their own land. Large international corporations interfering with local agriculture and creating economic and climate devastation for countries around the world. I think also the research on violence has largely been focused in urban contexts, if we're thinking about that first type of violence as being violence as defined by law. And that's problematic in a number of ways. One, for countries like Canada and Australia, where rural rates of violence are much higher, it means that we don't have necessarily adequate theories for understanding why. I think there's lots of questions about why that's happening, and as criminologists and rural criminologists, we need to be looking at answering some of those. But we also need to, of course, be answering that other side of it. So in considering those structural types of violence, how do we understand how that's occurring in those rural spaces, and how we can be working with those communities to protect those communities and to build local capacity. So I think these are some of the key ways in which that study of violence and rurality fit into rural criminology and the kinds of questions we need to be asking. So the main issue for me is what to do about these high rates of violence. So as I previously mentioned, we have higher rates of domestic violence, we have higher rates of assaults and person-to-person violence. So as a practitioner, I'm more interested in how we use that understanding to build local capacity, to work with local experts and local facilitators to do better work. So how do we encourage women to report incidents of DV when their attacker may be friends with a local officer? How do we reduce violence among kids when they see the same violence at home, and often they're fleeing that violence and spending time on the streets just to get away from that violence? And how do we change hearts and minds so that violence isn't seen as a suitable strategy for retribution, and how to best deal with a problem that emerges in a rural community. But also, how do we build that local capacity of community stakeholders within that sort of community safety constellation to address these issues in really meaningful and structural ways? Those networks of support have been removed in many communities, and we've almost lost the capacity to do this kind of work ourselves. And we require these service providers to come in rather than working more meaningfully together. Personally, I use a methodology that is from social work and education and nursing, and that methodology is action research. The philosophy is really shifting the expert status away from the researcher and on to the participant. They are their local expert. They know what's happening in the community. There's lots of ways in which we can collect that data, but we then become more a facilitator. How can we facilitate that knowledge and that local expertise and perhaps provide some capacity as well to create that transformative change? Nothing is sustainable in the work that we do if we just go in and take and leave. And this happens all the time in rural communities. People go and they do a rural stint where you sort of do your 3 years and then you get to move somewhere else. And this happens with health providers and educators and all these sorts of people who are constantly entering these communities, trying to push them towards a particular model of living, which may not be the most ideal model for those communities, and then subsequently leaving. What action research is trying to do is say, why not make these communities livable, so they're not places that people drop into and leave, so that the quality of life is not only better, but better for those who make those decisions, who live there and can make those calls. Beyond that, we need to, as researchers, be going out and making those connections with the practitioners who are already there and inviting them into our spaces as well. I think anything that breaks down these silos and makes these more accessible is going to make the changes in rural communities that we need to see and that those communities are asking for.